Hello, welcome. Hello to Atlanta, Chicago, everyone out there watching on the interwebs. Welcome to San Diego. My name's Costa. I'm from an organization called No Innovation. We do these pretty crazy science events. They're a lot of fun, and you're about to hear from some incredibly passionate and creative scientists here in San Diego. So if you're excited for that, let's hear it. Yeah. All right, great. Okay.
We have Sarah with Uber Hub.
Thank you. So I'm Sarah, and we are the Uber Hub. So the two U's in Uber stand for underrepresented and underserved, which includes environmental justice communities, other vulnerable groups, including inland communities. And what we propose is a model hub for all of the other hubs. So to put this in context, can you advance my slide, please? To put this in context, there's evidence that UU populations are more at risk to coastal disasters and are less able to adapt or respond to these coastal threats, as evidenced by recent hurricanes Maria and Katrina. So our vision for the Uber Hub is to connect innovation with discovery and interpretation and application of science by being inclusive through research, policy, and application. So what we learned, our background information, is that more diverse workplaces are more productive, more innovative, and more lucrative overall. We're already past this. Also, that short-term solutions lead to long-term problems. So what we propose is long-term solutions and relationships to solve wicked problems in the long term. Finally, we want to propose a model of engaged research that's connected with community networks to leverage what's already in place and not duplicate, so that we're meeting communities where they are and empower them to be involved from the beginning. So we have 3 specific, equally critical, actionable recommendations. The first one is that UU students are mentored by academic agency and industry partners, and this builds on existing opportunities, existing fellowships, existing mentoring and training from other agencies. And that connects with our idea that diversity equals innovation. Next, we are proposing citizen science projects, K-12 teacher trainings to include traditional community knowledge into data collection, analysis, synthesis, but also using the data from the other hubs to create products that the communities value. And this will help build trust with communities and scientists. Finally, we propose a diverse hub advisory board that provides mentorship and professional development for future hub leaders as a long-term investment strategy. Oh, and I lost my last slide, but it had 5 things on it. We are a model for other hubs, including diversity, equity, and inclusion. We connect innovation to traditional science methods, data collection, analysis, and modeling. We feel that it's important to incentivize DEI, money to interns, grants for teachers, and reward and recognition for science, including DEI efforts. Finally, we want to preserve cultural heritage and meet communities where they are and preserve diverse ways of knowing. Thank you.
Christine with Identifying Climate-Driven Stressors.
Our hub is titled Identifying Climate-Driven Stressors to Inform Coastal System Adaptation and Response. And we have an interdisciplinary team that put this together. And this is our model for what we feel the hub should look like and how it should function. So with an idea that we have early engagement using best practices in community engagement, we would talk to a diverse group of stakeholders that include communities, partner agencies, vulnerable communities, as well as scientists. They would identify coastal-related stressors, whether or not they recognize that they may be related to climate or not. At this point, based on the community-generated list, the scientists would hypothesize which of those concerns might be influenced by community-driven and by climate-driven stressors, such as ocean acidification, deoxygenation, sea level rise, or temperature. From there would be a feedback loop of research that includes observation in human and natural systems, mechanistic experiments that describe the role of drivers and their impacts, as well as modeling on natural and social systems with solutions that would be fed back to the stakeholders. With this, we had 6 specific recommendations that would enable us to put this hub into place. We would have early identification and continuous engagement with those diverse stakeholder groups, with a focus on identifying coastal concerns that link to climate-driven stressors, multiple stressors from long-term climate data sets that might or might not interact with local stressors. In addition, we would mandate specific criteria under which research was to be conducted, including leveraging long-term existing data sets if they're available, doing observational data collection that characterizes both the human and the natural systems, conducting mechanistic experiments, good basic science that gets us to the role of those drivers, as well as doing modeling in the natural and social systems that enable us to describe trends and forecast. We would do this in a way that could contribute to adaptation and mitigation strategies as a final product and integrate stakeholders at all elements of that loop. We believe that in doing this, we can improve coastal resilience that addresses stakeholder concerns. In addition, we can help diverse stakeholder partners from industry to communities to academia. We can help them forecast and predict risks and impacts. We can thus help have science-based adaptation and mitigation strategies, potentially then identify hotspots or refugia from some of these impacts, and that promote sharing of knowledge and technology transfer. We believe that this is the time for this highly interdisciplinary approach to coastal systems. It might reward high risk and high reward research that coordinates among diverse stakeholders and provides usable products back to those stakeholders, engaging them throughout the entire process of research and integration. Thank you.
Brett with CVD Cubed.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brett Sanders. I'm at the University of California, Irvine, and I'm presenting on behalf of my collaborators, Amy Javernick-Will from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and Hannah Brunig from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. Our topic is co-developing visualizations for dialogue, deliberation, and decisions. The idea, in a nutshell, is that the co-development of coastal hazard visualizations can make complex ideas accessible to anyone and enable dialogue, deliberation, and ultimately actionable decisions. So our recommendation to the National Science Foundation is that they support research focused on the creation and use of hazard visualizations to do a number of things: orient community stakeholders around complex hazards, draw out local knowledge about what people care most about, challenge researchers to understand the hazards better and communicate them in simple ways that can be visualized, test models, paradigms for community engagement with scientific data, and enable decisions that promote resilience in communities. To present this in a more practical way, we've drawn an example of this working nearby in Tijuana, Mexico, an area that's vulnerable to flooding and erosion during intense rainstorms, as we can see in this photograph here. With funding from the National Science Foundation, a group went into that community with a high-resolution model that enabled a better understanding of how hazards were localized, flooding coming down streets, between buildings, that presented a safety hazard for people in that community. And by engaging with the community, we also came up with simple ways of talking about flooding with a scale, a simple human body scale that made anyone easily recognize the risk that they were presenting. But as we went door to door with teams of outreach coordinators and personnel, when we talked to people in the neighborhood, we found that flood depth alone didn't completely meet their need for hazard information. They were exposed to water running off of the sides of hills, sediment coming down off the hillsides. And what was needed there was more information about erosion. And that led the research team to deepen their understanding of the erosional processes taking place there, develop models that could characterize that type of process at fine scale, and ultimately a visualization that aligned with that and then could be used for outreach and education so that the community did a better job of managing sediment in that system. So the impact and broad value of focusing on visualizations is numerous. We create many opportunities for meaningful engagement. It can apply to any natural system, complex system. It promotes iteration between researchers and stakeholders, and we create intuitive platforms, visualizations that anyone can understand risk information better. Thank you very much.
Next, Joe, extreme events.
Good afternoon. My name is Joe, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'd like to tell you about our idea for a hub on extreme and episodic events. Events such as coral reef bleaching, the marine heat wave in the North Pacific in 2015, and large-scale weather events as some examples. In a nutshell, we believe that observations are key to forwarding the science of episodic and extreme events. We think that there needs to be a coevolution of our understanding in geochemistry, human behavior, and the ecosystem state, both before, during, and after an extreme event. We think that baseline data, capturing data during an event, and following the recovery are key aspects of this study. If you don't have the data, you have no quantitative information about what's going on. The rationale behind our hub is to standardize, coordinate, mobilize, and fill in gaps with the effort to improve the rapid response and proactive research towards these events. We think that a better understanding of the coevolution of these various systems during and after these events would inform the drivers of resistance and resilience of coastal systems. And to our knowledge, there are no practical protocols that exist for coordinating baseline monitoring, mobilizing expertise, and sharing scientific tools. So what should we do? We think that following a hub that could follow protocols, as you see here, taking observatory systems that are already in place through various efforts by agencies across the nation, identifying gaps in observations such as being able to assimilate social media data for human behavior during an event, employing statistical and modeling tools, undergoing scenario planning, and conducting trial runs would build capacity and allow us to respond to all different types of events following a model like this. So our NSF hub would be at the center of this program to conduct comprehensive monitoring, observational data gap filling, standardization of data, fostering interdisciplinary research, and community engagement. And you can see all the various stakeholders that we would hope to engage with. I have 20 seconds left, so I'd like to thank you all for your time.
Denise, tipping points.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my honor to present our work on identifying tipping points across biological, physical, and social systems on behalf of the team that you see identified here. I think we're all aware of tipping points. They've defined a lot of our history across the globe, and it's a common term of usage in science and indeed in general society. I think we founders as an interdisciplinary group that we all defined it somewhat differently from different perspectives. But we came up with a working definition that this was about fundamental change in system dynamics resulting in often very serious consequences, fundamentally defined by the inability to recover. Why do we think research on tipping points is important? Well, you can see a number of the issues that we identified here. We think that it's worth decision makers understanding whether tipping points are inevitable or whether there are things that can be done to alleviate them in advance. What can be anticipated and what do we just have to react, perhaps as we have in the past? How do we allocate resources? Where can we be most effective with them? Who can benefit from those things? These are important decisions in coastal systems, and we think research can really help in this area. One other thing I really want to focus on here is how we're thinking about the coastal system. We're thinking about it in a very interdisciplinary way. You can see here 5 kind of subsystems: built environment, biotic, abiotic, societal, and economy. And we're thinking not only about what happens within each of those systems, but most importantly, how they interact together. What are the feedbacks and connections among them? How do they work? What are the time and spatial scales at which those interactions operate? What are the key driving processes? We want to think about how events and stresses, both acute and chronic, can actually influence the dynamics here to lead to tipping points. So as well as looking at all these interactions and really understanding how these things work together, we also actually have to understand the intricacies of each of the individual subsystems. And there are some examples of some of those components shown here. Here's just an illustration of infrastructure, for example, about how different parts of essential infrastructure really work together in the built environment to support communities in coasts and other areas. So how do we move this forward? Well, there are a number of challenges as we see here. Obviously, observations about extreme events are really difficult, and these interactions are very complex. There's a lot of things that we need to understand in order to be able to do this research. But we think it's really important. We think this is something where science can really make a difference and really help decision makers on the ground. By understanding these dynamics, measuring the effects of these internal and external perturbations and how they propagate through the system, and looking back at those historical examples, we think that we can put together information in some of these new integrative modeling frameworks which are now available. There's an awful lot of foundational information available that research like this can really build on to move things forward. We think we can really make a difference and hopefully anticipate and alleviate some of the effects of tipping points in the future. Thank you.
Next, Selena, participatory science.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Selena, and I'm here on behalf of my group, which includes Joyce, Amy, and Dave, and we're here to talk to you about public participation for actionable science. So our overall recommendation is for regional CoPe hubs to devote resources to public participation in research via citizen science, including support for research program development and PI training in citizen science programming, technical support, and that technical support would include data management, web hosting, visualization tools, and integration of citizen science data with mainstream science data. We also encourage the hubs to incorporate the importance of local context and a sense of place in the work that they do with local communities. The impact and value of citizen science is well documented as a cost-effective data collection tool. Well-designed and compatible local programs can be linked together to expand our scope of knowledge in biological, physical, and social sciences. If you think of mainstream science and the work that we do as providing deep information, but on a necessarily limited spatial and temporal scope, we can add that to citizen science that's a more shallow type of information, but across a much broader spatial temporal scope. There's also the advantage in citizen science programs of community engagement. It establishes a long-term relationship between science and the public. It's focused on actionable science that's locally relevant and accessible to a broad group of people. And those people can then work with scientists to observe patterns and changes in their own backyards and work together to understand why they're occurring. Our reasoning in supporting evidence really focuses on this untapped potential of citizen science for data collection, for early warning systems, for local information and dissemination, and maybe most importantly, for broadening participation in science, because with citizen science programs, anyone can be a member of the science team, which sort of makes it a little bit less of a black box that only a select group of people get to be in. And successful programs do exist and could be replicated and expanded. So overall, our recommendation is for NSF to expand citizen science from an outreach and education tool to a recognized and supported component of coastal research. Thank you.
Next, Chris with Boundary Spanner Functions.
Hi, thanks. My name is Chris Mayo, and my group members are Harriet Morgan, David Holland, and Farrah Courtney. We're here today to present to you Building Synergy Through Boundary Spanning Functions at CoPe Hubs. And the basic idea behind this is that innovative networking and communication techniques are going to be required and essential for hubs to function properly. Now, this starts with supporting local community champions. Now, these are the people on the ground that help to facilitate relationships with the community, afford us buy-in and legitimacy of our research projects when we enter these communities. Local leaders also allow us to gather and integrate local environmental knowledge into our research projects. These people are key to successful programs in local communities. It's also important that we have interagency boundary spanners. This is really especially important given the fact that there's multiple state, federal, and local organizations operating in the coastal zone. So through working with all of these groups together and spanning these boundaries, we're able to incentivize collaborations and leverage existing resources and programs. This is going to be a key fact because there's so many existing programs that are already very successful, so we want to benefit from previous learning. Another boundary span that we need to make is between industry and the regional hubs. Working with both traditional and emerging industries, we need to begin to foster new innovations that help us to tackle some of the very difficult and complicated issues facing the coastal zone. So some examples of this is leveraging data that industry has or that us as scientists have. It also includes supporting new tech development and utilizing some of those traditional factors such as fishing fleets and things like that to gather data to incorporate in our projects. It's also going to be really important for the regional hubs to instill this idea of multidisciplinary research. And they can do this by providing a platform where scientists of all disciplines can come together and discuss and plan for future research projects. And through building these relationships between these interdisciplinary scientists, synergy can occur, and we can instill this cross-disciplinary concept into all aspects of the research from the very start, from the planning to the completion stages. We also want to incorporate inter-hub boundary spanners because we know that we need the hubs to communicate together and plan for and build on the successes of each regional location. Thank you.
Corey with Leveraging Collective Impact Science.
Afternoon, I'm Corey, and I'm speaking on behalf of my team whose project focused on conceptualizing a CoPe hub that actually will leverage collective impact science, and was driven in large part by questions that arise over the course of these past few days, which include, are these CoPe hubs, are they issue-based or are they place-based? How is this new? How do we leverage the science within these hubs and how do we scale it up? And if the public doesn't trust science, how does CoPe build public trust? So So one way to envision regional hubs within this type of network might be placing particular projects or emphases within particular regional locations: coastal impact, coastal hazards, resilient fisheries, extreme weather, invasive species. However, that has the challenge of siloing individual hubs, and there's really no chance for cross-fostering or scaling. Another way you might envision setting these up is by equally distributing these research topics across all of these different regions. However, that's a very top-down approach to driving the different types of research that goes on in different regions, and there's less chance for local experimentation or responsive community interaction. The model we propose actually has all of these different research emphases, but they're tuned to actually emphasize local needs within each one of those regions. And so this particular model has the benefit of it being place-based with local tuning and cross-hub selection of research issues. There's also the added bonus in that having these different research emphases across regions incubates emerging issues and intransigent problems brought by community, mission, agencies, and mainstream science. We envision a general hub that's coupled with an Uber hub. And these regional hubs, what they do is they facilitate authentic connections with diverse communities in each one of these regions. And they're coordinated by a large regional hub, or a backbone in this case here, that's sort of coupled with a similar administrative structure and science emphases across all of these hubs. And what it allows for the transfer of knowledge generated at one hub back up through that administrative structure into the coordinating hub for synthesis, and the delivery of that synthetic information back into the regions, where it can then be shared back into the communities that those regions serve. And what this really creates, it creates a research dynamic that's interdisciplinary, that can draw on individuals like boundary spanners who can facilitate this two-way exchange of information between ethnographic communities, geographic communities, and communities of practice. And this creates multiple ways of knowing. And what this allows for through the hub structure is a deep collaboration and a virtuous exchange of knowledge that can lead to convergence or multiple ways of knowing things, which lead to actually transformative ways of looking at coastal research. And this also allows you through this hub structure to replicate successes on a national scale as well as failures that might occur on a national scale. And what you see emerging are new types of patterns, new types of solution, and similar types of impacts that occur across regions here. And what emerges are new ways of actually engaging with your communities as well as creating research for these hubs. And so we do have challenges but opportunities. One, how will these priority topic areas be identified and how will they change over time? How will the structure of this facilitate collaboration? And finally, if there's an Uber hub, what functions are going to be centralized or spread out to these different regions? And thank you.
Brian, with technological innovations and data engagement.
Happy Aloha Friday. We're an interdisciplinary group from also geographic diversity, envisioning CoPe as a mechanism to catalyze productive cross-fertilization by applying new and emergent technological and data tools to coastal problems. The public and our colleagues are hungry for tech solutions to environmental problems. We see interest in community monitoring programs, 3D printing applications, low-cost sensors, DIY maker culture, and CoPe can bring us all together to help in the coastal zone. We recommend a decentralized hub that would integrate researchers, students, community colleges, K-12 schools, philanthropic foundations, local governments, and help to catalyze public participation in STEM. We especially would emphasize bidirectional information flow from and among and between these different groups. Regional activities would take place on a daily, weekly, and monthly timescale, while monthly webinars, annual workshops, and meetings would help to allow for widespread sharing of lessons learned among the different geographic regions, which may have similar topical interests, but probably have different local innovative problem-solving approaches. This coordinated but decentralized structure, in our opinion, is very critical because the diversity is what helps to catalyze the innovation. So, blending emerging technology and data innovation with social and geoscience and public participation has potential to spark this inquisition process between and among stakeholders and regions. For example, the National Weather Service maintains about 15,000 research-grade meteorological stations nationwide, but Weather Underground crowdsources from over 250,000 stations globally from meteor-curious members of the public who put an anemometer on their roof because they want to know wind speed at their house. Previously, it's been cost prohibitive to envision anything like that for coastal science, but now we can begin to leverage emerging technology to develop an analogous spatial data explosion for coastline science. Similarly, drone and phone tech is exploding with advancements, and CoPe can help serve as a conduit to distribute this. Even when federal science budgets are attacked, there's always widespread recognition for the scientific and economic value of Sea Grant. We envision an NSF perspective version of something like Sea Grant. Both online and in-person engagement and communication is crucial to sustain and grow momentum for effectively building these programs. One specific but scalable case study that inspired our group leveraged Sea Grant and NSF basic research for geochemical coastal research with an NSF Workshop Award for public participation in STEM research. We brought together 30 practitioners from 18 different traditional Hawaiian fish pond restoration groups on 4 islands, taught them how to build low-cost tide gauges, and sent them home with a web URL so they had access to hyper-local tide data that wasn't previously available.
Mark with leveraging, leveraging, leveraging.
So you've heard the title. My team is Wee Yusuf and Rick Spinrad, along with Ariel Levine and Panos Providoros, who unfortunately had to leave earlier. Much of what we've been talking about the last couple of days is already being done by entities at the local, state, and national level. CoPe should address the grand challenge research issues that build upon and complement those existing efforts among these multiple entities. To do that, CoPe should provide resources, both human and financial, to all of the CoPe structure, from the hubs to the individual programs, to enable that leveraging and facilitate it, identify those leveraging entities, and connect the CoPe personnel, CoPe projects with those entities that are relevant to that. Part of that could be a chief leveraging officer that oversees leveraging amongst all CoPe activities to help facilitate it, identify those leveraging opportunities, and manage any potential risks that come up with that. Again, CoPe could develop a network of assets and resources that's both inclusive and expansive. Again, there are a lot of things that are already going on. You've heard about them in several of the previous talks. First and foremost among them is the National Ocean Partnership Program. It's codified in federal law, and it enables interagency collaboration and pooling of different federal agency resources to fund projects of common interest. There are multiple entities engaged in things like monitoring and observations in the coastal zone, outreach activities. There are geographically distributed entities. There are many of these entities that are already have strong mechanisms for end user engagement. There are professional societies and other entities that do networking and connection among different organizations. And most importantly, or perhaps very importantly at least, is advocacy. We need some way to independently translate the value and utility of what CoPe is doing to politicians and decision makers through entities like non-governmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Surfrider Foundation, private benefactors such as the Schmidt Ocean Foundation or the Paul Allen Foundation, and industry. There are large industry groups that could help us, and there are certainly many, many more. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Coasts in Context with Susanna, Melanie, and Allison.
Our recommendation is entitled Coasts in Context, Linkages Across Inland and Offshore. Coastlines have often been defined as a narrow band between the ocean and land. In reality, the processes affecting those areas occur on spatial scales from 10 to up to 1,000 kilometers in that area. The interactions between the different processes that affect these areas occur between land and ocean and land. And these include things like weather, movement of water, nutrients, sediment, and pollution, as well as the transport of people and goods and services. Therefore, the science of coastlines and people should also include the larger related inland and coastal and offshore areas.
Our recommendation is that coastlines and people create regional research hubs to address the important problems in each particular regional geography. The hubs should facilitate research on the linkages and feedbacks within the coupled ocean atmosphere terrestrial human system of that geography. The hubs should work with vulnerable populations in that geography from the beginning to identify the important science questions, and the hubs should also work to identify systems at risk in that geography. The hubs should provide opportunities for scientists from different disciplines, such as some of them listed on the right here, to work together to identify processes they can study that span that entire geography from inland to offshore that affects the coast.
Coasts and context will facilitate the connection of pattern with process and the utilization of methods and tools across disciplines and scales. In addition, it will motivate new remote sensing, modeling, and measuring techniques, and the studies of feedbacks and multiple stressors in these linked systems and the communication with local stakeholders will lead to new solutions to connected coastal problems. We envision that coasts and contexts our vision for coasts and context is such because coastlines do not exist in a vacuum. They're connected, and therefore the science must also be integrative. We also know that science is more societally relevant when a diversity of voices are involved from the very beginning. And lastly, existing NSF programs tend to create barriers to multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research. For example, much of the research I focus on in coastal Alaska is stuck between the Directorate of Geosciences and Biological Sciences. In essence, the concept of coast must encompass inland and offshore systems as well. Thank you very much.
Kevin with Welcoming the Water.
Hello. Coasts are defined in large part by their interactions with and proximity to water, yet we still live on land. What if we welcomed the water as our new human habitat? The specific recommendation of this vision is that NSF might think to develop science, technology, and social innovation to adapt in place to sustainable flooded or floating lifestyles, that is, to enable aquatic communities. This would take all of us. This would require broad participation and new participation modalities. There are profound opportunities for this vision to inspire innovations across the natural and social sciences, engineering, technology, and design, including imagining and understanding as yet unforeseen consequences of colonizing aquatic systems. What impact or value could this vision deliver? It could put basic science and innovation in an existential context of where people live. It would and must enable new technologies, materials, designs, and science that would likely have other unforeseeable uses and benefits. It would enable the maintenance of cultural, social, and economic growth without needing to fragment communities or remove them from their historical heritage along the coastlines. It would enable us to evolve humanity's relationship with our water planet, covered 70% by currently uninhabitable land cover. What is the reasoning or supporting evidence for this vision? We believe it is attainable. It's a little sci-fi, but it builds on things already happening today. It is not sustainable, cost-effective, or desirable for all places or all peoples to either keep the water out or to migrate inland. Fully aquatic adapted communities exist around the world, both with new developments off the shoreline of Dubai or indigenous communities on Lake Titicaca in Peru. These innovations are happening. The question is, are we learning from them? How do we get to scale? How do we get to safely, equitably, and sustainably allowing humans to choose remaining in coasts or flooded systems as a viable option? At present, the barriers are mainly scientific, technological, and social. And therefore, we are in a position of arrogance to suggest that coastal communities must move because we have not yet developed the means to enable them to stay. Thank you.
Katie and team with Future of Extremes.
My name is Katie, and I worked with Cindy, Kathy, and Haijong to envision the future of extreme event research. By redefining coastal extremes with an impact focus, we're used to considering major, low probability, high magnitude events for risk assessment and planning. But many processes affecting coastlines, like flooding, for example, could be extreme when the forcing is not. So for example, we could have compounding events, a combination of events where riverine and storm surge processes drive a flood transition zone, or multiple sequential events where rainfall, small amounts of rainfall over time could create a dam to overspill. We also have vulnerable populations and communities where a flooding event per se would not be hydrologically extreme, but may impact them in a very extreme way. Why are we interested in studying this further? Well, if we don't understand fully the combination of processes that drive extreme, there are millions of lives and properties that are at risk if we don't understand that true risk of the coastal hazards. And there are many past examples of underpredicted extreme flooding events in our recent past. And so our recommendation is to develop transdisciplinary approaches for characterizing the complexity of extreme events, where regional hubs would facilitate conversations and data and model exchange between natural, physical, and social scientists, engineers, decision makers, and key community members to move from modeling only deterministic worst-case events to also understanding and predicting processes that result in extreme impact events. In order to do this, the research priorities would include understanding the full distribution of the processes that combine to drive extremes and their uncertainty and variability in a non-stationary and changing climate, understanding how global scale climate changes could translate to the complexities of local problems, developing methods to value and quantify losses beyond structures and content loss, as well as integrating social and behavioral science into engineering and planning and recognizing the specific needs of diverse communities. The impact that this would bring to the community is advances in basic science, improved understanding of uncertainty and predictions, as well as a better characterization of risk to design better, safer, and smarter infrastructure. It would also allow for impact-focused communication with physical meanings that are easier to convey to the public, and hopefully be able to train future generations of scientists to perceive problems without the constraints of discipline. Thank you.
Next is Sissy with a community-based participatory research hub.
So our group's idea was to have a hub that was built on community-based participatory research and envisions communities as rights holders. This embeds the communities and the researchers together in the identification and the implementation of research agendas, the funding decisions, and in the assessment of broader impacts to the community. We need this because frequently communities are left out of research projects or are an afterthought. Requirements to document broader impacts of the research are often not at the forefront when research questions are developed and have little community voice. We understand how difficult it can be for scientists to work with communities, as we don't usually have the same language, we don't have the same depth of place-based experience, or have the same expertise. Forming this hub through this theoretical focus will help to build long-term relationships between researchers and communities, allow for more perspectives to be voiced in identifying research priorities and needs, and to foster greater alignment between community interests and the research products and outcomes. We envision a hub focused on true community empowerment. This will include communities at all stages of the research, into RFP development, the monitoring, and the evaluation, as well as the involvement in identifying and measuring the achieved targeted aims. The emphasis will be on long-term impacts on and benefits for communities rather than research for research's sake. We recommend that community-based participatory research training occur for the researchers, the organizations, and the communities. Research will be foremost for a community's benefit, and broader impacts should be the ones to guide the research questions. And an equity requirement in the RFP is recommended to promote inclusivity, as we recognize that additional funding will definitely be required. Through this hub, we seek to break down the barriers that exist between researchers and communities, to make research relevant and pertinent to community needs, to build sustainable partnerships and foster the building of long-term relationships, to facilitate better adaptive strategies, and to aid in the development of community-relevant scientific tools and best practices. As an example, in my community would be the current problems surrounding stormwater management policies and infrastructure. We would look to researchers from multiple disciplines for best practices on how to mitigate the flooding risks throughout our city, which has areas of glacial till that resemble concrete. The impact of implementation of unpopular federal stormwater management policies that are currently stifling our construction, our housing construction, exacerbating a housing crisis. And the economics of maintaining the different components that make up our stormwater systems, given our community's ability to pay for this. So cities like Port Angeles make policy and budget decisions with that much needed data. The results are that we end up mortgaging and burdening the next generation with problems that could have been avoided had we known the implications of our decisions.
Sarah with links.
Links. Linking convergent complex coastal systems. This is a topic that we have heard come up over and over again today, as well as earlier today in the other sessions. Our proposal focuses in on building the tools that can link different models of different spatial, temporal, and types across them in order to address community-identified needs. So the diagram on the right shows you these connections. All the black arrows are the things that we'd be focusing on. How do we develop connections between existing models and existing tools? This would be done in 3 phases. 1, we work with the community to identify a coastal problem. The next phase is the development of the tool itself. And then we have a feedback where we go back to the community for dissemination of the results, and this would incorporate large data visualization. The specific problems that would be addressed, again, would be based on community input. Here we have just 2 examples to give you an idea of what type of linkages we're talking about. So we have an example on the left of fishery impacts from climate change and hypoxic events, where you need to couple oceanographic, atmospheric, ecosystem models along with, say, an economic model. And on the right, coastal flooding, erosion, and infrastructure risk, where now you need to bring in addition to the atmospheric and oceanic models, a hydrologic model, a sediment model, an infrastructure model. And how do you form those links? What are those tools? So we're envisioning a suite of both computational and analytical tools that are driven by data. And the data would come into play both in terms of the validation of the end result, but also in terms of building that connective tissue that links these different models together. We've highlighted a couple key things here that we think are important: common platforms and wrappers, and common data formats and metadata. These types of tools, as well as the development of standardization across data sets and standardization across open source platforms for linking models, are things that are really important if we're going to be addressing these very complex linked socioeconomic and coastal problems. And there isn't a current funding mechanism that really allows for this type of development. So this is a place where we think CoPe could play a really important role. Oops, sorry about that. The deliverables that come from this include both the tools themselves as well as the project-specific outcomes, which might include hazard and risk assessments that span spatial and temporal scales, stakeholder engagement, and enhancement of big data and numerical simulation and visualization techniques. Thank you.
Next up, Maya will talk about Island Innovation Incubator.
Exclusive economic zones in the marine environment represent 1.7 times more area than the land mass managed by the US. The majority of this area surrounds islands. Along with colleagues from the University of Hawaii and the University of the Virgin Islands, representing the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, we present Island Innovation Incubators. Earth itself is an island. It has a limited pool of resources. It is a highly complex adaptive system. It is a highly complex adaptive system, but the scale is so large, it is challenging to study linkages between human and natural systems. Islands are proxies to Earth. They are limited in resources and connections to resources. Their small watersheds mean land and sea tightly connect, and they have tightly coupled human and natural systems. We recommend the creation of a hub with spokes and a structure to focus on island-based research, highlighting the unique risks and vulnerabilities of islands, their role as proxies for the Earth, and also the innovations and adaptations that have already emerged or will emerge from island systems due to limited resources and climate threat. We hope to develop a network of island-based research centers with community-driven research priorities. These will be convergent sites for considering the technological, institutional, environmental, and socio-cultural factors affecting isolated and tightly coupled systems. Some of the research questions one might look at are: how have varying social, economic, institutional, and biophysical factors shaped island social ecological systems over time? What are the social, cultural, economic, and policy implications of populations displaced by climate change? How have island communities adapted to slow and rapid environmental change? And how can the participatory process envision and create more sustainable and equitable futures? The added value from looking at island as incubators are the promotion of biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable development, reverse innovation in technologies, future-proofing adaptation, and governance surrounding their development and implementation, and broadening participation by increasing research and research capacities in areas with groups underrepresented in STEM. Thank you.
Alex with Rising Seas Beyond the Bathtub Model.
My name is Alex Sims, and I'm going to be sharing with you the ideas developed by Steve Boss, Ethan Allen, Robin Broden, and Susan Kidwell. And we wanted to start out with this image that you can see here, made by NOAA, that illustrates the simplicity of many and most models of coastal response to sea level rise, in which they have simply taken the 1-foot contour map and shaded everything below that to illustrate what might happen in the future in response to sea level rise. However, as we know, coastal inundation, landward migration of shorelines, and human mobility is not simple nor static. That the physical responses, the biological responses, and the human responses are really dynamic and complex. Now, inhibiting our understanding of these processes, there are many major knowledge gaps within the physical realm, the biological realm, and the human realm. Within the physical realm, we have many uncertainties with respect to the sea level projections. We don't truly understand the impacts that sediment redistribution, nonlinear trait, and erosional feedbacks might have on coastlines. Within the biological realm, there are many questions remaining about the ecogeomorphic feedbacks, thresholds and lags of ecosystems to sea level rise, the impact of multiple stressors, and coastal squeeze, and that marshes have no place to go because of the development landward of where they're located. And even more alarming are the unknowns with respect to the human dimension, and that there are no institutional models to make decisions related to how people move, where people move, when they move, and even more alarming, who makes those decisions. Now, each one of these processes is not acting alone. The human dimension is impacted by the biological component as well as the physical component, and in some degree, the humans also impact those biological and physical processes. So let's move beyond the bathtub. Our recommendation is that within CoPe, there needs to be an interdisciplinary research theme to develop models that generate data on the wheres, whens, and whats of coastline change to inform public policy. We need to start with community conversations at the beginning of the research to identify their needs and involve them in data collection. And each of these hubs needs to bring together the community, scientists, engineers, and policymakers. Thank you.
Jean and Jackson, CoPe Nodes.
On behalf of my team, I'm introducing the idea of CoPe Nodes. These nodes will enhance coastal resilience through community-driven research and education. First, for these nodes to work, we are assuming that the NSF will establish CoPe hubs. We strongly encourage that the CoPe hubs infuse education and research as a critical functionality. We envision that these hubs will have tight and productive collaborations with educational institutions and state and federal agencies. Our unique contribution is the idea of CoPe nodes. These will be small enough to be meaningful, but big enough to be impactful. These nodes will be rooted in coastal communities, and they will connect resources to local needs. They will fund local research to assist disadvantaged and/or underrepresented communities, and they will provide education on community-driven research.
So, how do these nodes work? Well, first, we will work with communities to identify needs and develop research agendas to address those questions. Then, a node and a dedicated science education liaison at that node will connect concerned organizations, interdisciplinary institutions, existing agencies, and other stakeholders around these questions. The hubs, at a higher level, will fund research around these questions which will produce educational products such as workshops, education, integrated K through 12 curriculum development, and other pieces to inform decision-making and action in those communities. This will progress an adaptive cycle to continue to ask and address questions in these communities. The overall impact we have here is to enhance community capacity for resilience. So we will be bringing diverse stakeholders together at the table. We'll be addressing community needs, whether those be social, ecological, or environmental. We'll be building researchers' skills with collaboration and communications through engagement right there. And we'll be educating to assist the holistic collaborative stewardship alongside intergenerational capacity to address community resilience.
There's ample reasoning to justify why the CoPe node should be created for community scale education and research. We are well aware that problems involving the coast and people exist. The education specialists and researchers housed at the nodes will find them using their connections within the community, the educational institutions, the state and federal entities. These nodes will build stewardship and intergenerational appreciation for science. This is what we're calling K to Gray education. This community-based node approach can feed into the larger CoPe hub network to support the evaluation and tech development of models, best practices, and tools for enhancing coastal resilience. Thank you.
Here we have Bob with New Tech for Data Collection.
Thank you. Our team's recommendation, CoPe recommendation, was to dramatically expand the use of new technologies for high-resolution coastal data collection. The problem is that our ability to detect and forecast change in coastal systems is severely hamstrung at present by the lack of spatially and temporally adequate data. And we think that this problem can be addressed now by supporting the use of new and underused technology for coastal observation. And to break this down, our recommendations are to increase our capabilities to collect high-resolution spatial and temporal data by expanding the use of cost-effective, off-the-shelf sensors and technologies and platforms, and develop new technology and adapt existing technology to collect data. And finally, to make both existing and new data much more openly available and easily discoverable. The impact and value of this recommendation, first and foremost, is that time series and spatially dense data is absolutely necessary for building and validating accurate models of coastal change, which often rely now on assumptions or data from far-flung places. High-resolution data can, moreover, better support local decision-making by collecting local data, and can be paired with remote sensing data for stronger large-scale inferences, including global inferences, and ground truthing remote sensing data, making it more valuable itself. And new technology can facilitate involvement of citizen scientists by putting sophisticated but inexpensive sensors in their hands to collect data that can be later analyzed by experts. Some examples of technologies that we envision are aerial and underwater drones and sensor suites, which are becoming much more expensive and turnkey. In situ imaging, including in situ imaging flow cytometry for phytoplankton, time-lapse video for fish and human activity, such as fishing and beach use, for example. Machine learning to analyze these images, which are often analyzed by hand at present. Low-cost LiDAR and sonar to measure coastal erosion, bathymetry, and biological habitats at high temporal frequency and over wide spatial scales. And metagenomic data to get a much better handle on the distribution of microbes, including pathogens, and plankton, including harmful algal bloom species in space and time. Thank you.
This is Mate with CSP.
Thank you. Our proposed recommendation is called Connecting Science and People, or CSP for short. This effort is led by Cambio Liu from Louisiana State University, Mark Mio from University of Oklahoma, and myself, Mate Georgescu from Arizona State University. CSP has at its core two objectives that are simultaneously concurrently occurring. They are, first, to communicate scientific information to non-scientists and the end user or stakeholder community. And also, first, to communicate research needs of communities and stakeholders to scientists. At its core, CSP is cross-cutting. It is of extreme value to everybody that has ever submitted an NSF proposal and will continue to submit an NSF proposal in the future. It is therefore not necessarily disciplinary focused. We envision CSP to be an office within a central hub or an office located according to different regional hubs, depending on how the strategic deployment of the hubs is set to occur. CSP, the office, which is set to consist of professionals that are actively engaged and participating and have aware of processes, models, methods that are in line with the current scientific community. They offer proactive actions toward disseminating and communicating information to communities. Simultaneously, CSP is focused on an effort to organize scientific and technical information, data, and analysis. Recall that this staff is a professional staff that is very well versed in technical and peer-reviewed literature communication, and therefore can translate the actual research enterprise into useful and usable science for communication. The conceptual organization of CSP's semi-traditional hub and spoke approach. And so we are motivated by the following example. Imagine three PIs, one from University of Oklahoma, one from LSU, and one from Arizona State University. And they're formulating a project, and this project is cutting edge in every sense of the word. But because of our limited scope of what's happening outside of our academic universities, we are limited in our ability to communicate our research results to those communities that need it most. Therefore, CSP acts as a matchmaker to put us in touch with the municipalities, industry, government, and business, those stakeholders that need this science most. In turn, CSP also acts as a liaison to foster communication among the stakeholders themselves, therefore creating usable and transferable information. CSP collects information and disseminates information from these various stakeholders, multi-scale depending on the research question that is posed, and through traditional and novel approaches using webinars, seminars, and face-to-face meetings that both engage the communities at large and foster a trust that is currently missing in the scientific community. Thank you.
Diego, Science of Extreme Events.
Okay, so the ideas developed here have been developed with Jeff Marshall and Sheehan, and the big idea is that we recommend the formation of a hub that will be focused on the science of extreme events, hazard events, whether they're from a tectonic origin like seismic events, tsunamis, landslides, or more climate-related events like storm surges and hurricanes. One of the specific recommendations that we have is that there's an emphasis in research that goes into understanding the processes that trigger these events and the recurrence intervals, the frequency, and the severity of the impacts that we can expect from these events. Along with that, we would like to see the idea of supporting existing sensor networks that collect data that is crucial not only to the development of the research, but also that can support and enhance existing forecast and warning systems that go a long way in terms of protecting the population against these hazards. And a good example of the motivation for this recommendation is what happened in Japan in 2011, where despite the amount of research in seismic and tsunami science, the exposure to this hazard was largely underestimated by the state-of-the-art science there. So another recommendation that we have is actually twofold. And one is that there is a partnership that we partner with existing organizations that may be sharing common goals. And so the objective here is not to duplicate efforts, but to actually coordinate efforts so to working towards a common goal. And so that would be one of the focuses of the hub in terms of being an overarching organization that will perhaps coordinate or provide a line of communication between existing different organizations that share the same goals. And then the other one is actually the creation of a rapid response to the occurrence of these extreme events that happen very rarely, but that when they happen, they generate a huge amount of ephemeral data that it's crucial for scientists for the development of their research. And it's very hard for scientists to organize in such a short amount of time because this data has a lifespan of hours to a few days. And it's very hard to find the channels to facilitate field surveys of these events. So that's another one of the recommendations we'd like to make. And then lastly, we'd like to recommend that the hubs are focused on transitioning research results to the communities so that the research that happens at the lab level can be translated into actionable decisions that will go to protect the coastal populations. And when these decisions, emergency management decisions, public policy decisions are informed by the state-of-the-art science, that's when they become more robust and more useful towards protecting coastlines and people. Thank you.
And Krista with relational poverty.
Thank you. And I'm the last one, as I think you can tell from the board over there, so thank you for your patience and your tenacity, I think. So I'm Krista Kamer, and as you can see, I was part of one of the larger groups. We had 6 very passionate, fairly opinionated women work on this, and I think it would be an understatement to say we weren't already a little bit fired up by what's been going on recently before we even got to this topic. We each brought with us a very different approach and to the issue of vulnerable populations, and I think our different perspectives meant that we had to really work through each point and all of its details and hash out the nuances and agree on a common language that we were all comfortable with, and in the end we were able to develop an idea that we could all unanimously support. So we think it's fairly obvious why we need to talk about the impacts of coastal events and conditions on vulnerable communities, but in case you've been living on the moon, things like Puerto Rico and Katrina, Harvey, Irma, Maria, all are illustrations of why, how environmental impacts disproportionately affect precarious, vulnerable, and disadvantaged populations. And we wanted to add in more than just disadvantaged populations. So a disadvantaged population is a low-income population without sufficient resources. But you can also have precarious or vulnerable populations or livelihoods or communities or people where they're not disadvantaged, but they're very fragile, and just one external perturbation could put them into the disadvantaged category. So we wanted to include all of those in our discussion. What we suggest is that as part of the NSF CoPe program, there be a focus on the impact of coastal events and conditions on vulnerable human communities. And these can be a number of different things, from discrete acute events, which is what we tended to talk about initially in our conversation, but we also wanted to focus on episodic recurring events that could be predicted, as well as chronic conditions. So these are some of the examples here of the different types of coastal events and conditions that affect vulnerable communities disproportionately. We recommend that there be a multidisciplinary integrated approach to evaluating the effects of these coastal events and the environmental conditions on human communities. So for example, with ocean acidification, you have the natural science component explaining the biology and the biogeochemistry of ocean acidification. You need the economics to look at the impacts of ocean acidification on the community and on individuals. And together, those can feed into changes in public policy that could hopefully make the community more resilient. We believe that you need to understand the effects on all communities in order to understand the disparate effects on the vulnerable communities. And what we ultimately hope happens is that with this work, we can move towards understanding the creation and the characteristics of precarious communities in order to more further develop public policies and social programs that create equity instead of just equality among these vulnerable populations. Thank you.
Here's Candace from the National Science Foundation.
Well, guys, that's it. We've come to the end, and I'd like everyone to give themselves and your colleagues here a big hand. I think, speaking for myself and my NSF colleagues, that was an inspirational last 2.5 days. We appreciate so much the energy and effort and deep thought that you've put into this. The ideas that you've come up with are, I haven't just seen individually creative and exciting ideas, but the combination of creative ideas in new ways, and I think we're at a great point now to launch to the next step. And this is just the beginning. As I said before, this is a launching point that will then go back to, we have an enormous amount of information and input to digest. Please encourage your colleagues who were not able to participate in the workshops to give feedback through the email. There's a link on the website, the coastlinesandpeople.org website. We're looking for all of the input, the community input that we can get, and we will be thinking long and hard about this over the coming weeks and months. So again, thank you so much, and thank our colleagues in Atlanta and Chicago and who participated virtually. I think with the hundreds of people involved, we are going to come up with something really great. All right, thanks again.